Oscar was there, in the corner of the diner, with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on his skin, making him look paler than usual. His gaze, fixed on the rain-smeared window, was distant, but his body remained tense, poised. The steam from his coffee rose to the ceiling, like a reflection of the restlessness he was trying to hide. At the table beside them, the conversation continued without anyone noticing that he wasn't listening. Outside, the sound of tires cutting through puddles and the hurried conversations of drivers filled the air. The old gas station at the corner, with its flickering lights, was already a familiar sight to anyone who lived in the small town of Oak Ridge. Nothing there seemed out of the ordinary, but the truth was, nothing would ever be the same after that night. And Oscar knew that. Mabel entered the diner with her smile. It was the kind of smile that made you forget what you were doing. Oscar felt the weight of her presence, like a stone thrown into a lake. He glanced at his brother, Owen, who was sitting at a nearby table, and just a quick, subtle movement of his neck was enough for them to understand each other. She walked over to their table. Mabel, with her light brown hair and sparkling eyes, asked if she could join them. Oscar, always the more impulsive one, was the first to speak. "Of course, Mabel, sit down please." He smiled, but the laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. She didn't notice, or maybe, she just didn't care. Owen, on the other side of the table, merely looked at her with a disconcerting calm, as if he already had everything under control. The interaction was brief, superficial, but there it was, the first move in a game with no turning back. What Mabel didn't know was that, in that very moment, she was being observed in two completely different ways. Oscar saw the girl with eyes of possession. Owen, more calculated, was only interested in control. They were different, but that night, Mabel wouldn't see the difference. The game had started, but no one knew where it would lead. Oscar had never liked to lose. Since he was a child, it had always been that way. Life was a competition, and deep down, he knew Mabel was just another prize to be won. He saw the look she gave Owen, and it made his chest tighten, something he couldn't control. Owen, however, was calmer. He had already prepared for what was coming, and he knew the game would only get more interesting as the days went on. The atmosphere in the diner was noisy, but to Oscar, everything seemed in slow motion. He was about to take the first step to put his plan into action. Something was about to happen. Mabel smiled and asked about their work. Oscar talked about his bike shop, while Owen, as calm as ever, spoke about the cafe he had recently opened in town. They both spoke almost identically, and if anyone had been paying attention, they would have noticed how eerily similar their words sounded when they came out of their mouths. But Mabel didn't notice. She laughed at something Oscar said, and suddenly, the sound of her laughter cut through the silence of the place. Something in the way she smiled made the brothers feel even more distant from her, and that was enough to fuel their desire to possess her. "Did you know Mabel already visited my cafe?" Owen asked casually, not taking his eyes off Oscar, but the tone of his voice seemed more like a provocation. Oscar felt his heart race. "Oh, really? I didn't know. What a coincidence," he replied, forcing a smile. But Oscar's mind was elsewhere, calculating the next moves. He needed to act fast. Owen watched more carefully. They were nearing the point where the strategy would have to change. But what he didn't know was that Oscar wouldn't let that happen so easily. Mabel looked at both brothers, not quite understanding what was going on. She didn't know, but that night would be the beginning of something no one could predict. She smiled, but their game, silent and subtle, was already underway. And unknowingly, Mabel had just stepped into the trap they had set for her. Mabel settled into her chair, taking off her coat and draping it over the chair beside her. The conversation flowed naturally, but something in the air seemed heavier than usual, as if the atmosphere carried a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. Oscar noticed the tension and forced himself to relax. But the growing warmth at the back of his neck didn't go unnoticed. He knew what he wanted, and Mabel seemed to be the key to it. Owen, on the other hand, seemed as at ease as always, his gaze distant but alert, watching the behavior of others in the diner, a reflection of his calm. He didn't need to try to please because he knew he already had everything under control. To him, Mabel was just another challenge, something to keep the game interesting. However, there was a growing unease in his mind. He was wondering if his strategy would work the way he imagined, or if Oscar would end up ruining everything. The conversation between them stayed safely in the realm of trivial matters. They talked about the weather, the struggles of living in a small town, and even commented on the old local cinema, which hadn't shown new films in over a year. Oscar wasted no time trying to be charming, laughing at his own jokes, playing up his charm naturally. Mabel responded with smiles and glances that the two brothers interpreted differently. But for her, they were just polite responses. Neither of them realized how much she was paying attention, or rather, how much she was silently being drawn into a game they didn't even realize was a game. She was now talking to Owen, the conversation drifting into more personal territory. He asked about her plans for the weekend, and Mabel mentioned a local event, a street fair being set up for Labor Day. Oscar found himself lost in his own thoughts, but the realization that Mabel was, without a doubt, more fascinating than anyone he had ever met left him uneasy. She had that power not to dominate, but to stir the emotions of those around her. And in Oscar's case, that was something he wasn't willing to allow for long. She had the power to make him feel more vulnerable than he wanted to admit, and that scared him. "Are you going to the fair?" Mabel asked, looking directly at Oscar, bringing him back to the present. He smiled, but inside, an electric current ran through his body. "I was thinking about going. Maybe, if you're going, we could go together. What do you think?" Owen merely watched, saying nothing, but there was something in his gaze, a shadow, indicating he wasn't completely comfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Oscar didn't notice the tension. He was too focused on Mabel's smile, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way her hands moved as she spoke. To him, everything was falling into place perfectly. "I'd love to," Il replied, and Oscar couldn't contain the pleasure he felt hearing those words. "Let's do it then." It was a step, a simple step, but for Oscar, it was confirmation that the game was starting to turn in his favor. The night dragged on a little longer, with the conversation flowing pleasantly, but without depth. They were merely going through a social protocol, preparation for what was to come. When Mabel stood up to leave, Oscar walked her to the door. Owen stayed at the table, fiddling with his phone, seemingly oblivious to the interaction happening. But his eyes were fixed on Oscar, and the way he treated Mabel with a familiarity that seemed more intimate than it really was. "See you later, Oscar," Mabel said with an open smile, leaving behind a sense of something unfinished, something hanging in the air. "I'll see you on Saturday. I'll see you on Saturday," Oscar repeated, and as he watched Mabel get into her car and drive off, a smile slowly spread across his face. It wasn't a victorious smile, but one of satisfaction. The first step had been taken, and the second would come soon. He turned to return to the table where Owen was waiting, and the silence between them was heavier than ever. It wasn't the silence of mutual understanding, but the silence of two people beginning to feel that something was about to break, something that couldn't be undone. That night, in Oak Ridge, nothing seemed as simple as it appeared. The game had just begun, and the brothers were about to become entangled in a web of lies that would only intensify. Mabel, unknowingly, had already been touched by their shadow, and her life was about to change forever. But until then, she had no idea what was coming. The weekend was rapidly approaching. The street fair was on everyone's lips in Oak Ridge. Mabel, with her easy smile and cheerful spirit, seemed unaware of the complexity of the twins' intentions. To her, it was just another opportunity to go out, meet friends, breathe a little outside her routine. But for Oscar and Owen, it was something much deeper. The game was in full swing, and they knew every move had to be calculated. Oscar was more impatient than usual. Every moment spent without being with Mabel felt like an eternity. However, he remained calm when he was with her, always with a smile on his face, always saying the right words. But inside, anxiety gnawed at him. He couldn't afford to lose. Not after all the time spent planning this. Not after everything he had done to get this far. Owen, on the other hand, was in a colder state. He knew the game required more subtlety, more control. For him, Emotions were always under control, and Mabel was just a piece on the board. What mattered was control. Mabel was merely a distraction for both of them, something to keep the game interesting, a way to measure how far one could go without the other noticing. Saturday came, and Oakridge transformed. The streets were filled with colorful stalls, music began to play in the distance, and the smell of homemade food mixed with the aroma of wildflowers filled the air. It was a festive day for everyone, but for Oscar and Owen, it was just part of the plan. They met in the central square, near the Ferris wheel that dominated the scene. The meeting point for a day that promised to be marked by more than just simple fun. Mabel appeared shortly after, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes shining with the golden light of the afternoon sun. She looked beautiful. Oscar smiled when he saw her, but deep down, a small knot formed in his stomach. He didn't quite know what he was feeling. He was starting to question whether he only wanted to possess her, or if it went beyond that. Owen noticed the small change in his brother, but said nothing. He was more focused on observing, always observing, as if he were a step away from discovering something more. The afternoon passed without incident. The fair was filled with laughter, music, and lively conversation. They walked around the stalls, looked at shop windows, tried homemade treats, and every now and then their eyes would meet meaningfully, as if they were playing a game of glances that no one else could understand. Mabel seemed happy, carefree, as if nothing bad could touch her. But Oscar was increasingly aware of something. He wasn't feeling as he should. He had everything he wanted. Mabel was there with him, but there was a frustration he couldn't explain. Owen was silent, but his eyes never stopped following Mabel. Subtly but constantly, the afternoon turned into evening, and the lights of the fair began to shine more brightly. The sound of laughter and music blended with the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the distant murmur of cars passing on the main road. That's when the small Ferris wheel began to spin slowly. Mabel, her eyes full of curiosity, suggested they go there. The idea seemed fun, and Oscar, always eager to please, immediately agreed. "What do you think, Owen? Shall we take a ride on the Ferris wheel?" Mabel asked, but her eyes were fixed on Oscar, as if she already knew he would be the one to accompany her. Owen hesitated for a moment, but soon stood up and said he didn't want to. "I'll stay here, thanks. Enjoy yourselves." His smile was brief, and despite seeming friendly, there was something restrained about it. Mabel didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She took Oscar's arm, and together they headed for the Ferris wheel line. He had a smile on his face, but inside, he wondered how far he could go before things started to get complicated. The way Owen behaved, always watching from afar, made his blood boil, but he couldn't get distracted. He had to focus on Mabel. He had to make her his choice. As they got into the Ferris wheel cabin, the wind caressed their faces. Oscar felt exhilarated. Being there with Mabel at night, with the city beneath them and the music still echoing, seemed perfect. But there was an uncomfortable feeling in his chest, something he couldn't identify, but that was becoming more and more present. "I never thought Oakridge looked so beautiful at night," Mabel commented. Looking at the city below them, "It's as if the world is simpler, calmer." Oscar looked at her, his smile softening. "I've always thought that the beauty of a place lies in how you see it. You see Oakridge with different eyes." She laughed, and he felt the tension ease, but only a little. Deep down, he knew there was still more to be done. Mabel had a power over him, something he wasn't prepared to deal with. And the truth was, at that moment, he didn't know if he was in love with her, or if he was just using her to fill a void he didn't even understand. When the Ferris wheel reached the top, the view of the city below seemed magical. Mabel was in awe, and Oscar, for a moment, allowed himself to be caught up in the scene. But his mind soon turned to Owen, who down below seemed even more distant. The silence between the two brothers seemed to deepen with each passing minute. At the end of the night, when the cold wind had already begun to bite, Mabel said her goodbyes. "It was a great day," she said with a genuine smile. "Should we do this again soon?" Oscar watched her leave, and for the first time, something inside him wavered. She seemed so innocent, so far from their intentions. She was there, unaware of anything, just living in the moment. But for the twins, it was impossible to turn back. The web had already been set, and Mabel, unknowingly, had taken the next step in the game. But Owen still hadn't moved. He kept watching, waiting. He knew the situation was about to change, and when it did, the truth would come to light, but not in the way Oscar imagined. What Oscar didn't know was that Mabel herself was beginning to suspect something. But that night, she still didn't know how entangled she was becoming. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge seemed to have returned to its quiet, welcoming routine. The fair had left behind only the memories of a day of fleeting joys. But for Oscar and Owen, all that remained was the weight of a game that was beginning to slip through their fingers. Mabel had left the Ferris wheel with a smile on her face, but Oscar felt that smile was only part of the story. Something was out of place. He didn't know exactly what it was yet, but the discomfort followed him, like a persistent shadow that refused to disappear. Oscar spent the morning in silence, trying to process what he had felt the night before. Why that emptiness? Why that sense that, at some point, something would slip out of control? He usually didn't care about such things. He had always known he was good at manipulating, good at making people think what he wanted them to think. Mabel, up until that point, seemed like just another piece in the game, but unlike other girls he had won over. Something about her seemed to touch a part of him he didn't want to face. He didn't like it, but at the same time, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Owen, for his part, was calmer, but no less attentive. He spent his days in his usual routine, hopping from one calf to another, watching people, studying them with almost scientific precision. He knew how to observe like no one else, how to see beyond the masks everyone wore. And that's what drew him to Mabel. She didn't have that typical facade the other girls wore. She was different, but not in an obvious way. She had something he couldn't yet identify. But that intrigued him. Owen always had a way of controlling situations, of keeping his distance, of protecting himself. But Mabel was affecting him in a way he wasn't used to. It wasn't something he could control, and that made him uncomfortable. The two brothers, despite being identical twins, had different ways of approaching whatever was at stake. Oscar was impulsive, decisive, loved the taste of conquest, of approval. Owen was calculating, patient, and knew that the most valuable things came with time and precision. On Sunday, Mabel met with the two of them again. They had agreed to go to a local cafe, Sunshine Cafe, a place that had become a popular hangout spot for the young people in town. The afternoon sun filtered through the cafe windows, illuminating the wooden tables and comfortable chairs. It was the type of place where you could talk without rush, without the pressure of the world outside. Mabel arrived first, and as she entered, the welcoming atmosphere immediately enveloped her. She ordered her usual coffee and sat at the table by the window, watching the people passing by on the street. But something was starting to bother her. It was a strange feeling, a sense of being watched without quite knowing by whom. When Oscar and Owen arrived, the cafe door opened with a little bell announcing their arrival. Oscar entered with his usual easy smile, and Owen, with his calm, enigmatic gaze, followed right behind. They approached the table where Mabel was sitting, and, unlike the other times, Mabel felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something odd in the air, something she couldn't quite identify. "Hi, Mabel," Oscar said, leaning in to kiss the top of her head. He always seemed so confident, so sure of himself. And Mabel, although she felt the tension in the air, smiled at him, thanking him for the kindness. But there was something insincere about the way he approached her, something she couldn't define. Owen sat beside her, but in a more distant way, more observant. He was always in control, always setting the pace of the conversation, never letting things slip out of his grasp. "How's your Sunday?" he asked, his voice soft, but with an intensity that seemed to suggest something more. "It's great," Mabel replied, trying to sound casual, although she felt a growing pressure. "I was just thinking about the things I saw at the fair yesterday. Everything was so lively, but in a way, also very superficial." Oscar smiled, not understanding. "What do you mean? Didn't you find it fun?" She hesitated before answering. "Yes, it was fun, but it seems like people are always rushing to the next event, to the next thing. I don't know, I feel like I'm missing something, like I'm being left behind. Owen, who had been watching her closely, raised an eyebrow. You think you're being left behind? He was teasing. Testing her responses, but his gaze was intense, as if he was minutes away from uncovering something. Mabel bit her lip, feeling the pressure. Sometimes I wonder what really matters. It seems like the things we think are important don't hold as much value. People, places, I don't know. Oscar leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms. You're saying nothing matters? Then what really matters? Mabel felt uneasy with the question, but tried to hide it. I don't know. Maybe. I haven't found the answer yet. Owen watched every word she spoke, every expression. He was testing the situation, trying to figure out if she was letting herself be vulnerable, or if she was just protecting herself. You'll never know, Mabel. Not until you decide to look for something real, something that really makes sense to you. The conversation continued, but Mabel felt that something was different about the way the two brothers were acting. They were different, yes, but in a way she couldn't understand. She knew something was off, but she was so absorbed in their words, in their smiles, that she couldn't find a way out. Saturday night was just the beginning. The talks about trivial things were just a facade for what was happening behind their eyes, for what was happening behind the unspoken words. Mabel started feeling a growing sense of discomfort, but the game was already underway, and deep down, she knew something big was about to happen, something that, unknowingly, would involve her in a way she could never have predicted. But until then, she didn't realize how much she was about to get lost in the web the twins had prepared for her. The night everything changed, Mabel didn't know what was coming. The air in Oak Ridge felt still, as if the city itself knew something was about to be uncovered. She was alone in her apartment, looking out the window. She thought about everything that had happened in the past few days, the conversations, the smiles, the exchanged glances, but she still felt a strange emptiness, as if she was lost somewhere between what was real and what wasn't. The coffee from the previous morning was still fresh in her memory. There was something uncomfortable about the brothers, something she couldn't explain, but didn't want to pay attention to. They were charming, but at the same time, Mabel had a feeling they were being more than just a romantic interest. Their behavior didn't make sense, unless there was something more, something she didn't fully understand. She looked at the clock. It was almost p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. But at the same time, she couldn't stop thinking about how the two brothers had gotten so close to her in the past days. The idea of being courted by two identical men made her nervous, but somehow, she had gotten used to it. The conversations, the exchanged looks, even the messages. But something wasn't adding up. Something was wrong. Then the apartment door slowly opened. The sound of the key in the lock made her heart race. But before she could move, Oscar appeared in the doorway. His face was serious, different from his usual jovial expression. He was wearing a black leather jacket, and the look in his eyes was something deeper. Something darker. Mabel, he said, his voice deeper than usual. I need you to listen to me. There's no way out of this. She didn't understand immediately, but the discomfort she felt began to grow. What are you saying, Oscar? He closed the door behind him, looking around as if he feared being overheard. Owen and we've been doing everything wrong. We can't keep going like this, and you need to know the truth. Mabel felt a wave of confusion, a growing sense of desperation. What do you mean by doing everything wrong? She was starting to realize that the game she thought she was playing might not be as simple as she imagined. Oscar took a step closer to her, as if about to hesitate, but before he could speak, the apartment door opened again. It was Owen. He entered silently, as always, with his calculating look, and went straight to Mabel, without even looking at Oscar. What's he doing here? Owen asked sharply, addressing Mabel, but never taking his eyes off Oscar. The tension between the two brothers was palpable, almost as thick as the air around them. Mabel stepped back a pace, feeling like she was in the center of a storm. She no longer knew who was telling the truth, and the way the brothers were acting seemed more than simple jealousy or rivalry. Something deeper was going on, and she felt like she was about to be dragged into it. What are you guys doing? Mabel asked, her voice trembling. What's going on between us? And why does everything feel so strange? Oscar looked at Owen, their eyes sharing a silent understanding. Then, he took a deep breath. And the confession that followed made the ground seem to open up beneath her feet. We have to tell you everything, Mabel, Oscar began, with brutal sincerity. Owen and I, we're more than you think. We've been pretending to be one person all this time, while you thought you were getting to know just one of us. It was actually both of us. We took turns, Mabel. The whole time, Mabel stood frozen, speechless. What she was hearing seemed absurd, like a nightmare. She looked from one to the other, trying to find any trace of humor, any sign of a joke, but there was nothing. They were both serious, and now that she was paying attention, their eyes had something sickening about them. What do you mean? Mabel stammered, the weight of the truth hitting her mind. Are you telling me that, all this time, you were pretending to be one person? Owen spoke next, calmer, but with the coldness that made Mabel's skin crawl. Oscar and I have always done this. Since we were kids, our life has always been a competition. Our parents taught us to be the best, to be the only one. So, when we saw you, Mabel, we saw the opportunity to do the same. Mabel looked at them, incredulous. But, did you fall in love with me? With me? One person? Oscar stepped forward. It's not exactly like that, Mabel. We fell in love with the idea of being the only one. And when we saw you, we knew we had to play the game right. You never knew anything. You never knew we were manipulating all of this. Mabel felt a whirlwind of emotions. The pain of betrayal, the anger, the fear. It wasn't just about the twin brothers. It was about herself, about what she had allowed to happen, about the lie she had been living. She had been a piece in their game all along, but the worst part was what was coming next. She knew that, if it was all true, if their manipulation was real, she would have to make a decision, something that would make her question what she truly believed in, loyalty and trust. The truth was there, naked and raw, and she didn't know how to handle it. What was left now was to choose what to do with the pain that was beginning to fill her chest. Oscar and Owen were there, waiting for her reaction, but Mabel no longer had any certainty. Mabel felt a wave of dizziness that seemed to sink down her body like a crushing weight. She didn't know if what she was hearing made any sense or if, in fact, she was starting to lose her mind. But Oscar's gaze, Owen's cold, calculating stare, their words, everything was fitting together, but in the most grotesque way possible. Oscar stepped closer, almost as if trying to comfort her, but she instinctively stepped back, a reflex of self-preservation. He stopped just a few inches from her, the words on the tip of his tongue. But he seemed to hesitate, as if trying to choose the best way to manipulate the situation further. I know this is hard to understand, Mabel, Oscar said, his voice almost soft, but believe me, we never meant to hurt you. Owen watched silently, a spectator in the scene, showing no visible emotion. He knew how false Oscar's words could sound, but that didn't matter. For Owen, control of the situation was in his hands. He had always known how to position himself, how to keep a distance so he wouldn't get too involved. But now, he was watching his creation fall apart, and in a way, it fascinated him. But you're hurting us, Oscar replied, her voice choked with anger and confusion. You're telling me that, all along, it was both of you? How could I have been so blind? Oscar seemed to shrink slightly at her words, and for a moment, Mabel saw a glimpse of who he really was, someone more insecure and broken than she could have ever imagined. She didn't know if that made her feel even more uncomfortable, or if it made her pity him. I didn't want this. I swear. I thought it could work, he said, as if explaining something perfectly logical. But the truth is, both of us got lost in this game. At first, it was just fun. It was just about control. But after we saw you, after you came into our lives, things started to change. Owen interrupted, his tone calculating and emotionless. The obsession, Mabel, isn't about you. It never was. The obsession is about what we represent, what we can be when we play this game the right way. Mabel felt a fierce anger rise within her. mixed with the pain of betrayal. How could someone be so cold? How could anyone engage in such a sick game? The sense of deception was suffocating, and no matter how hard she tried to process it all, the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. "Do you think this is normal?" Mabel asked, her eyes filled with tears. "You pretended to be a person, a single man, to manipulate me, to make me believe I was in love with someone who didn't exist." Oscar stared at her with an unsettling intensity, as if trying to read her, as if searching for a way to justify his actions. But unlike Owen, who was distant, he seemed more fragile. As if, by telling the truth, he was giving himself up in a desperate way. "Mabel, I know it seems insane," Oscar said, stepping closer. "But we were conditioned like this. You don't understand, but since we were kids, this was all we had. We don't know how to live any other way. And when you showed up, you became more than just our conquest. You became something we needed to win together. Because, deep down, Mabel, we never knew what it really meant to love someone. We only knew what it was to possess you." Mabel felt the weight of his words, and for a moment, she wanted to believe there was something more behind this madness. But what she felt, more than anything, was fear. The fear of being swallowed by a psychological game of unsustainable proportions. She looked at Owen, who now seemed more interested in his brother's reaction than in her. He was distant, controlling the situation in his own way, not caring about the collateral damage. To him, the game was never about feelings, but about strategies. "So, what do you want from me?" Mabel asked, her voice trembling but determined. "Now that the truth is out, what do you expect from me, Oscar? Do you want me to accept that I'm in a game I never asked to play?" Oscar watched her with a mixture of sadness and anxiety. He knew he was losing control. He knew, somehow, she was beginning to see them for what they really were, two men willing to do anything to fill a void they could never understand. "I don't know what to expect, Mabel," Oscar replied, with a heavy sigh. "But I know I don't want to lose you. Not the way we lost everything before." Owen gave a small smile. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of approval, as if the revelation had merely been another part of their plan. He took a step forward, as if to give the final push for everything to crumble completely. "But losing you, Mabel, was never the goal. The goal was always to control everything. To see who could be the best. And in the end, we will always be two. No matter what you choose to do with that." Owen's words hit Mabel like a weight on her chest. She felt the ground disappearing beneath her, and no matter how hard she tried to react, their words echoed in her mind, making her question everything she thought was real. What was love? What was loyalty? She didn't know anymore. The truth, just like the weight of what was happening, was immeasurable. Mabel found herself at a dead end. She no longer knew if she could trust herself. She didn't even know what it meant to be loved or desired. Their game had been planned with such care, such coldness, that she was about to be dragged into a web from which she could never escape. And the worst part was that, deep down, Mabel felt a part of her that still cared about both of them, a part of her that, even knowing she was sinking into an abyss, couldn't let go. The air around Mabel felt dense, almost sticky, as if Oscar and Owen's words had created an atmosphere of irreversible tension. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to the door and never look back at them. But at the same time, something stopped her from acting. A weakness, perhaps, a part of her that still didn't fully understand what was happening, but felt, in a visceral way, that she no longer had control of the situation. They had flipped the switch, and now she was standing at the gates of hell, one foot in, the other still trying to find a way out. Oscar seemed to sense the impact of his words. He was tense, his eyes shining with something deeper than simple regret or guilt. There was a desperate need to be understood, as if, deep down, he knew he had lost Mabel even before he tried to win her over honestly. He was the first to break the silence, his voice wavering but full of an almost desperate urgency. "I know you don't understand, Mabel," Oscar said, his eyes fixed on hers, as if he expected her, somehow, to comprehend the complexity of his behavior. "But this is all we know. It's always been about being the best, about who can conquer more, control more. And you became our obsession, our final test. It was never just about you. It was about what you meant to us. To me, Mabel felt an increasing pressure in her chest, a dull pain spreading slowly. She wanted to scream, wanted to break free from the emotional prison she found herself ever more tangled in. But something inside her kept her there, silently, listening to what else Oscar and Owen had to say. But this doesn't make sense. Oscar, she finally spoke, her voice cracking. You used me, used a lie, and you think I'm going to accept that? Like I'm just a piece of a game? Oscar stepped forward, trying to reach her, but Mabel instinctively recoiled. She no longer knew what to do, what to feel. The confusion was a dense fog in her mind, smothering her reactions, the words she wanted to say. What do you want from me, Oscar? Mabel asked, her eyes brimming with tears. Now that the truth is out, what do you expect? That I choose one of you? That I forgive all of this? Oscar looked down, breathing deeply, as if the words that needed to be said were stuck in his throat, afraid to come out and make everything even more irreparable. But before he could respond, it was Owen who stepped forward, with his usual calm, but with a sharp look that seemed to calculate every move, every word he would say. Do you think it's that simple, Mabel? Owen asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're not here to ask for forgiveness. We're not here to ask you to understand. We're here to show you that, in the end, there is no choice to make. And if you don't understand now, you'll understand at some point. Mabel looked at him, trying to find some sign of humanity in his unshakable gaze. But what she found was absolute coldness. She felt small before them, trapped in a game she never wanted to play, not knowing how to get out without hurting herself even more. Everything felt like a big trap, and she no longer knew who was manipulating whom. If she looked at Oscar, he seemed desperate, almost human in his vulnerability. But Owen was impassive, calculating, as if he were observing an experiment from afar. And then, Owen's words fell like a bomb. Do you really think that now that we know you're going to try to leave us, there's a way to do it without consequences? Owen said, with the calmness that made Mabel's skin crawl. Because, Mabel, we're not in control anymore. You are. The feeling of powerlessness took over her, and for a moment, Mabel found herself in a horrible dilemma. They were right, in a way. She was trapped between them, and getting out of it would mean facing a pain she wasn't sure she could endure. But there was also something more at stake: the loss of her dignity, the loss of herself. She couldn't keep allowing men to manipulate her emotions so easily. But at the same time, leaving that web meant cutting something much deeper, something she didn't fully understand yet. Oscar seemed to read her thoughts. He took another step closer, extending his hand, but Mabel pulled away. She could no longer trust anyone there, not even him, who seemed so vulnerable, so human. Fear now was about not being able to escape this whirlwind of emotions, these power plays she hadn't noticed. I'm not part of your game anymore, Mabel said, with the tone of decision she surprisingly found within herself. You made me think I had a choice, but I never did. I was just a piece of your competition, and now there's nothing I want. Oscar looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep pain that she wasn't prepared to witness. Mabel, don't do this, he pleaded, his voice now fragile. I know we did everything wrong, but please, don't go. But Mabel could no longer hear his words. She was lost in herself, in a sea of anger, pain, and the need to get rid of it all. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she needed to distance herself from the two brothers and somehow regain control of her own life before it was too late. With a deep sigh, Mabel grabbed her purse and turned toward the door. She knew she was making a decision that would change everything, that would likely distance her from any chance of finding love or peace with the two of them. But above all, she knew she could no longer be part of that game. She was leaving. Not just that apartment, but a life that had been built on lies. But as she opened the door, she heard one last phrase. This time, it was Owen who spoke, his voice sharp and unapologetic. You can go, Mabel, but remember, we will always be two. No matter what happens, we will always be two. The door slammed shut, and Mabel didn't look back. She knew that, perhaps, she would never see the twins the same way again. But one thing she was sure of, at that moment, she was finally free. Part 4. Consequences of the revelations and gradual resolution of events. Mabel's life was never the same after that night. She distanced herself from Oscar and Owen as she had promised. But the weight of their words and the images of everything that had happened with them followed her. The confrontation left marks on her soul, which seemed impossible to erase. There was something deeply unsettling about Owen's final words. "We will always be two. No matter what happens, we will always be two." It was as if that had rooted itself inside her. An echo that wouldn't fade. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mabel tried to get back to her routine, go to work, find some meaning in the normality of her life. But how could she when her mind was tied to those two brothers? Every time she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt divided. As though the part of her that had stayed with them was no longer the same. As if the love or whatever it was that they had manipulated in her mind had changed her essence forever. It was at work, in the small cafe called Morning Brew, where she always had her coffee, that Mabel began to feel the weight of the emptiness. She didn't know why she still forced herself to come here every day. Maybe it was out of habit, or maybe it was because the place, with its cozy atmosphere and the soft conversations in the background, was a way to escape the memories of Oscar and Owen. It was there that she met Leah, a friend from college who had disappeared from her life recently. Leah, with her open smile and calm energy, became an anchor for Mabel. When she saw her, Mabel smiled, a shy but genuine smile, something she hadn't done in weeks. "Are you okay?" Leah asked, straightforwardly. She didn't like seeing Mabel so faded. "I think you look more tired than usual." Mabel thought for a moment. The idea of telling Leah about Oscar and Owen, about everything that had happened, seemed absurd. Leah would never understand. No one would ever understand. But she also knew that she needed an outlet. Something inside her begged for a confession. "I don't know what to do anymore," Mabel said, looking at the coffee in front of her. "I'm lost. I thought the worst had passed, but I feel like I'm still trapped." Leah looked at her carefully and then leaned forward, touching Mabel's hand gently. "You don't have to figure everything out alone, Mabel. Sometimes things get so big in our heads that we forget we can take small steps to start over." But Mabel knew that it wasn't just small steps she needed. It was more than that. She needed to confront the ghosts still in her life. She needed to break free once and for all from Oscar and Owen. For that, she would have to do something she never imagined she could. Take the final step to ensure the twins were no longer part of her future. Oscar was at home, staring at the blank, lifeless walls of his apartment. The darkness of the place reflected the darkness within him. He didn't know whether he felt anger or regret, or if perhaps both feelings consumed him in a way that made it impossible to tell apart. But something in him knew that his situation with Mabel had changed forever. His obsession, possessiveness, the way he kept her around, none of that mattered anymore. She had already left him, and Owen's presence, always cold and calculating, didn't help ease the pain. "What do we do now?" Oscar asked, his eyes empty, his arms crossed over his chest. He couldn't understand how he had reached this point. How he had lost Mabel the way he had. Owen sat across the room, looking with the same empty gaze he always maintained. He didn't seem shaken, didn't seem to feel the loss with the same intensity as Oscar. To him, it was all part of the plan, part of the war between them. "You think too much, Oscar. We already knew this was going to happen." Oscar glared at him, frustration growing inside him. "No, you don't understand. I loved her." "Love you is just a weakness," Owen replied calmly, a slight smile on his lips. "What matters is control. And in the end, what we did was show her who we really are." Oscar swallowed hard. That conversation, Owen's cold outlook, made him feel like a lost child. But he didn't know what to do anymore. His obsession with Mabel now seemed like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. It was as if he had lost not just a woman, but his very identity. "I'm going after her," Oscar said, his decision taking form. "I'll show her that all of this wasn't a lie." But Owen didn't move. He just looked at Oscar, his smile widening. "Go. But remember, Oscar. You're not the only one who can manipulate. Mabel was back to her routine. She had found a way to breathe, a way to regain the serenity she had lost in the past weeks. She began to avoid the places where she used to see Oscar and Owen, and encounters with friends and colleagues became more frequent. All she wanted was to forget, but at the same time, the weight of their presence still lingered in her mind. Even the simplest steps felt too heavy. It was on a Sunday, when she was alone in her apartment, that she heard the doorbell. She hesitated for a moment, not knowing whether she should ignore it or open the door, but something pushed her to stand up and walk to the entrance. When she opened the door, Mabel found Oscar. He was standing there, in front of her, with dark eyes and trembling hands. There was no longer the easy charm or the confidence he always exuded. Now, he just seemed lost. "Mabel," he said, his voice heavy with the raw emotion Mabel had never imagined hearing from him. "I need to talk to you." Before Mabel could respond, he entered the apartment without asking for permission. And it was at that moment that the cards were finally laid on the table. Oscar entered Mabel's apartment without waiting for a response, with the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. Mabel stepped back, unsure of what to do. There was something wrong in his posture, as if he was forcing himself to maintain some facade that was now about to crumble completely. When he closed the door behind him, Mabel felt the air grow heavy, as if the space had shrunk, making everything more oppressive. "I know you don't want to see me," Oscar began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "And I can't blame you for that, but I can't stand being without talking to you anymore. I did everything wrong. Everything." Mabel didn't know what to say. She watched him, trying to decipher the words coming from his mouth. She knew it was a desperate attempt to regain her trust, but the truth was, she was tired of manipulation, tired of being tossed back and forth between him and Owen. "You and Owen, you used me," Mabel said, her voice trembling. The memory of all of it, the pain of realizing she had been part of a twisted game, hit her like a blow. "I'm not a game, Oscar. I'm not a piece you can move around as you please." Oscar looked wounded, but it wasn't the kind of wound that came from sincere regret. It was something deeper, more possessive. "It's not like that, Mabel. It wasn't what you think. I just wanted to be with you. Just you." Oscar's words began to lose themselves, as if he was trying to comprehend what had happened between them. Love, desire, obsession, it all seemed to mix in his mind. Mabel felt an urgent need to expose the truth, to expel that poison from her life once and for all. "What do you want from me, Oscar?" she asked, her voice firm, yet heavy with the sadness she couldn't hide. "Do you want me to believe what you're saying now? After everything that's happened, there's no going back." "Oscar, not for me." Oscar took a step forward, but Mabel stopped him with a gesture of her hands. "Don't come closer," she said, almost instinctively. He paused, but the expression on his face revealed the conflict he was feeling. He was on the edge of something, either losing control for good, or finally accepting it. I can't live without you," Oscar said, the pain in his voice more tangible than ever. "I know I hurt you, and I know you won't forgive me, but I need you to understand, Mabel. I never wanted things to end up like this. You're everything I've ever wanted." Mabel closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. What he was saying was both a plea and a veiled threat. He wasn't apologizing. He was trying to convince her that his love justified everything, even the lies, the games, the manipulations. She knew that if she kept listening, something inside her would break, and she'd never be able to rebuild what was left. "You're saying you love me, Oscar?" Mabel asked, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "And how do you call everything you've done to me? What do you call what you and Owen did?" Oscar swallowed hard, his gaze averted as if he couldn't handle the truth Mabel had just laid before him. He tried to deflect the blame, as he always had, justifying the means by the ends, but the words failed him. What he didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, was that his obsession could never be confused with love. What he felt was possessiveness, a sick need for control, not real affection. Mabel turned toward the window, feeling the weak afternoon light pour in and illuminate her face. Something inside her told her she could no longer let herself be consumed by this scenario. She couldn't allow herself to fall into the same trap again. "What you and Owen did to me was irreparable, Oscar," Mabel said, her voice now calmer but still firm. "And I can't continue being part of something that doesn't respect me, that doesn't see me as a human being, but as a trophy. I can't." Oscar stood still, his expression empty, as though he was still trying to understand the magnitude of what he had just heard. He had come this far, but he didn't know what to do now that the path was close to him. The obsession he had for Mabel, the need to possess her, the control he sought, all of it was disintegrating right in front of him. Mabel, for her part, no longer felt anger, but a strange sense of relief. She felt like she was finally freeing herself from all of it. She was taking control of her own life again. But before she could take another step, the doorbell rang. Oscar looked at her with a confused gaze, but Mabel just sighed. She knew who it was before opening the door. It was Owen. When Mabel opened the door, she found Owen standing there, his expression cold and distant as always. He watched her for a moment, as if assessing the situation. "Oscar," Owen said, with a tone of reproach, "you know what you need to do." Oscar looked at him, still in shock, but something in Owen's gaze made him take a step back. I know," Oscar replied, his voice faltering. "What happened between the three of us was wrong. But we can't go back," Mabel said to both of them, firmly. "I'm no longer part of your game." Owen didn't move, but his expression, for a brief moment, seemed more human, more vulnerable. He knew deep down that things were lost. But the two brothers still couldn't accept that. They were still lost in their own shadows, not knowing how to escape them. Mabel closed the door without another word. She didn't need them. What was left now was to move on. Mabel stepped away from the door, feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. She looked around her apartment as if for the first time, seeing the space with new eyes. The smell of freshly brewed coffee still lingered in the air, but everything seemed empty now. The silence was deafening, as if the apartment itself was waiting for an explanation that Mabel knew she could never give. How could she explain to herself everything that had happened? How could she explain what the twins had made of her? She sat on the sofa, her hands trembling, her thoughts in turmoil. What else could she do but close the door and move on? Oscar's words still echoed in her mind. But now, there was no more room for them. There was no more room for either of them. The cycle was broken, and Mabel knew that, by taking that step, she was finally freeing herself. But what about the wounds? What about the emptiness that filled her soul? For a moment, she thought about calling someone, telling someone what had happened, asking for help. But the words seemed useless. What she needed at that moment was to be alone. She needed time to process everything, to let the pain settle. As Mabel stood there, lost in her thoughts, the doorbell rang again. This time, she didn't hesitate. There was nothing left to hide, no way to protect herself. She stood up and went to the door, unafraid, no longer confused. When she opened it, she found Owen again. But now, he wasn't there to speak, not to try and manipulate her. His gaze was empty, distant, as if he had been broken in a way Mabel never imagined. "What do you want, Owen?" Mabel asked, her voice hoarse, still overtaken by emotions she didn't know how to process. Owen looked at her for a long moment, his eyes, once cold, now filled with something she couldn't define. He didn't speak, but his presence there seemed to say more than any words could. There was a void in him that Mabel had never seen before. It was as if, somehow, he had also lost something or someone, and was trying to understand what it meant. "I know you hate me," Owen finally said, his voice low and emotionless. "But I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness, Mabel. I didn't come to say I was wrong, because I know I was. But I need you to know one thing." Mabel watched him, unsure of what to expect. Owen had never been someone who opened up to others, much less to her. What did he want now? What was the reason he was here, standing before her, when there was nothing left between them? "I've always known you wouldn't just be mine," Owen continued, with a heavy sigh. "But that's not what I wanted. I just wanted us to be more than what the two of us were." Elle furrowed her brow. Owen's words didn't make sense. How could he have been so cold, so calculating, and now, all of a sudden, wanted to share a piece of his soul with her? Are you still stuck in that, Owen? Mabel asked, her voice filled with disbelief, tinged with a hint of anger. After everything that happened, do you still think there's something between us? That it has any value? Owen stared at her with an intensity she had never seen before. It was as if he was finally freeing himself from his own inner prison, and maybe this was the last trace of an internal struggle. He didn't know how to win. I don't know what else to do, Mabel. I don't know what more I can say. I just wanted you to know that it's not just you who ends up lost in all of this. Mabel stood silent for a moment, absorbing his words. She didn't know if he was truly sorry or if this was just another attempt at manipulation. But a part of her, a small part, weakened by pain, felt sorry for him. It was strange, but she felt that he was lost in a way she couldn't ignore. There was no more hatred in her heart for Owen, only a deep sadness. I don't know what you expect from me now, Owen said finally, breaking the silence. But you need to understand that this is over. There's nothing left. There's no more us. No more games. I'm not a prize to be fought over, and I'm not a lie that you can live with. I'm a person. A real person. Owen didn't respond right away. He stood there, looking at her as if trying to absorb everything he had just heard. Mabel could have said more, but something inside her told her that the words no longer had power. He had heard enough. She had heard enough. After a long moment of silence, Owen finally turned. He didn't say anything else. Wordlessly, he took a step back, as if the burden he carried was finally too heavy to bear. He left Mabel's apartment without looking back. The door closed with a soft click, and the apartment, once again, fell silent. Mabel stood, not knowing what to do next. She sat back down on the sofa, feeling that the relief of finally taking control of her life was almost palpable, but at the same time, a strange emptiness remained. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she needed to move on. Without the twins, without the games, just her, alone, searching for what it truly meant to be free. She looked at the window once again, watching the sun slowly set on the horizon. The end of one cycle, the beginning of something new. The path was open now, and despite everything, I felt she was finally ready to walk it. But what she didn't know was that not everything had been resolved. The truth behind Oscar and Owen still hadn't fully emerged, and there were still shadows on the path that she would have to face. The future, still uncertain, held its own secrets, and fate, sometimes, has a cruel way of reminding us of that. Mabel woke up early that morning, the sun already high in the sky, and the city of New York still in its early breaths of activity. It was a new day, but everything seemed, somehow, still suspended. She slowly got out of bed, feeling the weight of sleepless nights, unfinished conversations, and decisions that, though they seemed right at the time, didn't lessen the emotional burden she carried. The truth that had been revealed about Oscar and Owen still burned in her mind, but now she was beginning to understand that the real battle wouldn't be against them, but against herself. What would she do with what was left of herself after everything that had happened? The kitchen was quiet, and the coffee was still in her mug, steaming, waiting to be sipped. Mabel looked out the window, the light breeze stirring the curtains and bringing a sense of renewal she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt a light peace, but there was still something inside her, twinge. As if she knew the journey wasn't over yet. She sat at the table, holding the mug with both hands, trying to organize her thoughts, but the confusion wasn't as overwhelming anymore. Slowly, the memories of the past few days began to calm, like a storm finally dissipating. Mabel knew she would need to find a way to rebuild herself. No longer for others, but for herself. However, there was one thing she still needed to resolve: the future of Oscar and Owen. She didn't know exactly what would happen to them, but part of her couldn't completely leave them behind. Not because of what they had done, but because of who they had been. And maybe because of who they could have been, if they had taken a different path. She knew she couldn't completely ignore the consequences of what the twins had caused, but something inside her told her that there was no more space for games, no more lies. They needed to face the truth, just as she had. And if that meant opening the door to forgiveness or even to a new kind of friendship, she didn't know. But she wasn't willing to live with the weight of doubt anymore. Determined, Mabel picked up the phone and made a call, a simple gesture, but one that meant so much. She knew it was a necessary step. She needed to talk to someone, not to get answers, but to give herself a chance to feel more whole. It was time to seek the closure she had been longing for. The phone rang several times before someone finally answered. "Hi, Mabel," a familiar voice from a friend responded. "What happened? Are you okay?" She smiled, relieved to hear the voice of someone who hadn't manipulated her or involved her in deceitful games. "Yeah, I'm okay, but I need a little help, some guidance. I don't really know what to do with everything that's happened, but I feel like, if I talk to you, maybe I can start to understand." The friend's voice, silent for a moment, responded with empathy. "Of course, Mabel, I'm here. Tell me what's weighing on you." Mabel closed her eyes for a moment. She knew she didn't need immediate answers. She didn't want to get caught in a cycle of explanations and apologies. What she needed now was time. Time to rebuild. To understand how to relate to the truth without it becoming an overwhelming burden. Her life was still ahead of her, and she knew she had the right to move forward, no matter how difficult it might be. When she hung up the phone, Mabel felt a little lighter. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was something in it that made her feel hopeful. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't willing to be manipulated anymore. Not by anyone, and certainly not by herself. She spent the rest of the day tidying up the small details of her life, cleaning up the remnants of the emotional mess the twins had left behind. Every movement felt like a small victory. She wasn't looking back anymore, nor getting lost in the lies that had been told, the manipulations she had been caught in. She didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain: she didn't need anyone else to define who she was. When night came, Mabel sat on her apartment's balcony, looking at the city that never sleeps. The lights shone brightly down below, and the sound of the city was like distant music. She smiled, feeling at peace for the first time in a long while. The story she had lived with the twins was over, and with that, she felt as though she was burying a dark chapter of her life. But what was to come wasn't a continuation of pain and confusion. It was something new, something she would begin to write herself. With a lighter heart and a clearer mind, Mabel knew she had all the tools to start over. Not to please others, not to fit into anyone's expectations, but to live for herself. And, as difficult as it was to understand or accept, she finally realized that she had the right to be happy. She took a deep breath, and the night, silent and vast in front of her, seemed to promise new possibilities. Everything was open, and with that, her story truly began. Mabel spent the following days in a state of quiet tranquility. Something she hadn't known for a long time. What had been a whirlwind of emotions and manipulations was now fading, and what remained was a strange sense of freedom. It was as if she had finally woken up from a nightmare that had lasted years, not knowing how she would wake up, but somehow feeling stronger than ever. She spent more time with her friends, people who had never tested her, people who saw her as she was, without distorted expectations or hidden agendas. She had dinner with her parents, who, although unaware of the details of everything that had happened with the twins, knew something had changed in her. Mabel didn't talk much about what she had lived through, but they knew. The pain was still there, pulsing between the lines, but with each passing day, it faded a little more. However, even surrounded by support, a feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. It was a whisper in her mind, something that prevented her from fully relaxing. The question that persisted was, what would happen to Oscar and Owen now? They were still out there somewhere, in her life, and the idea that she could just walk away from them seemed impossible. Mabel still felt she needed to understand the true nature of the relationship between the twins, but that didn't mean she wanted to get involved with them again. It was more about finding some kind of answer to the questions she didn't dare ask aloud. Why had Oscar, so intense and obsessive, and Owen, with his cold, calculated demeanor, risked losing everything? Why had she become a piece in their twisted game? There was something more there, something she needed to understand so that she wouldn't carry the weight of these questions forever. It was then, on an ordinary afternoon, that Mabel decided she couldn't live with the uncertainty. She picked up the phone and called Owen. Maybe it was madness. Maybe she was looking for something she didn't even know, but she knew she needed it. The questions were growing inside her, and she knew that if she didn't face them, they could consume her. The call took a while to be answered, and Mabel's heart began to beat faster. When Owen finally responded, there was something different in his voice. There was no longer the cold manipulation, the caution that used to mark his words. There was only silence, and somehow, that felt more frightening than anything he had said before. "Mabel," he started, his voice still low, but more sincere than she had imagined. "I knew you'd call." She took a deep breath before replying. "I need answers, Owen. I need to understand what happened." What was that? Why did you both do this?" There was a pause, and Mabel felt he was weighing his words, perhaps more carefully than she had imagined. "I think it was always about need, Mabel. A need for control, for belonging. I don't know how to explain it. When we grew up, we were always seen as a unit. We were always more than brothers, more than separate people. For us, you were something to be conquered. And when the idea of you started weaving into our lives, it became more than we could control. But you were destroying everything," Mabel replied, the pain still clear in her voice. "Everything I thought I understood. Everything I thought I was. How could you not see that?" Owen's silence was long, as though he was finally trying to understand himself. "I know it was wrong, Mabel. I knew. But it was easier to live within the lie, within what we knew, than to face the reality. Because deep down, we both knew we'd always be inseparable, but never in a healthy way." Mabel felt a hot anger rise within her, but also something else. Understanding, perhaps, a bitter understanding. It wasn't that she forgave, but she could, in some way, understand how it had become possible. How they had gotten so lost in their own game that they couldn't distinguish the line between love and obsession anymore. "Then, what will happen now?" Mabel asked, her voice calmer, but still firm. "What comes next?" Owen sighed. "I don't know, Mabel. I don't know if I can change or fix what we've done. But maybe it's too late to try to go back to what we were. I only know that you have the right to move on. And I won't interfere anymore." Mabel felt a mix of relief and sadness. She knew this didn't mean everything was resolved, but at least there was some kind of answer. Perhaps it was enough for her to begin understanding that their past would no longer define her. The weight of psychological games, obsession, and manipulation was finally starting to fade. "Thank you, Owen," Mabel said with a sigh. "Now, it's time to move on." She hung up the phone and, for the first time, felt a sense of closure. Not that the pain had completely disappeared, but she knew she had taken the first step toward healing. She was no longer a victim of their lies. She was a woman in search of her own truth, her own freedom. Time passed, and Mabel continued to rebuild her life. She found new purpose in her work, in the friendships she carefully cultivated, in the new experiences life offered her. But the most important lesson she learned, and never forgot, was that the truth, no matter how difficult and painful, always brought the chance for a new beginning. And as the weeks went by, Mabel knew her future would be whatever she chose to make of it. No longer a shadow of what others expected of her, but a woman free from her own past. And somehow, that was all she had ever needed. She looked out the window of her apartment, the city skyline before her, and smiled. The sun was setting, but this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.